War doesn't just happen. It erupts from ambition, fear, and the collision of ideologies. The United States, a nation forged in revolution, has faced conflicts so devastating they reshaped its identity. But what forces ignited these wars? Why did millions die in battles over slavery, freedom, and global dominance? Strap in as we unravel the 5 deadliest wars in U.S. history, exposing the political powder kegs, moral failures, and desperate gambles that plunged America into chaos. The truth is darker than you think.
Mega History Presence.
Number 5. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War was a proxy battle in the early Cold War, rooted in the post-World War II division of Korea. After Japan's 1945 surrender, the Soviet Union occupied the north of the 38th parallel, while the U.S. occupied the south. Competing visions of governance communism in the north under Kim Il-sung and capitalism in the south under Syngman re-escalated tensions. Kim, backed by Stalin and Mao, sought to unify Korea by force, launching a surprise invasion on June 25, 1950. The U.S., fearing the spread of communism, a doctrine called containment, persuaded the UN to authorize military intervention. President Truman framed the war as a moral obligation to defend democracy, but underlying motives included protecting Japan, a key Cold War ally, and proving U.S. resolve after the loss of China to communism in 1949. However, General MacArthur's push toward the Chinese border provoked Mao, who sent 300,000 troops to aid North Korea. The war devolved into a brutal stalemate, with massive civilian casualties from U.S. bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder. The 1953 armistice froze the conflict, leaving Korea divided and setting the stage for decades of hostility. Number 4. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. Vietnam's struggle began as a colonial rebellion against French rule. After Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh defeated France at Dien Bien Phu, 1954, the Geneva Accords temporarily split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, promising reunification via elections. The U.S., fearing Ho's communist ties, blocked elections and backed anti-communist dictator Ngo Dinh Diem in the South. Diem's oppressive regime fueled the rise of the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla force supported by North Vietnam. The U.S. escalated involvement under the domino theory, the belief that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. The fabricated Gulf of Tonkin incident, 1964, where North Vietnamese boats allegedly attacked U.S. destroyers, gave President Johnson congressional approval to deploy ground troops. However, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics and the North's Ho Chi Minh Trail supply route neutralized U.S. technological advantages. Public outrage over atrocities like the My Lai Massacre 1968 and the Tet Offensive's psychological impact turned the war into a political liability. Nixon's Vietnamization policy failed, and Saigon fell in 1975. The war exposed the limits of U.S. power and deepened Cold War paranoia. Number 3. World War I, 1917 to 1918. World War I began in 1914 as a European conflict over imperial rivalries, alliances, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The U.S., under President Wilson, initially stayed neutral, profiting from trade with both sides. However, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare sinking ships, like the Lusitania 1915, which killed 128 Americans, and the Zimmermann Telegram 1917, which proposed a German-Mexican alliance against the U.S., forced Wilson to declare war. America's entry was framed as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy, but economic interests played a key role. U.S. banks had loaned billions to the Allies, and a German victory would jeopardize repayment. The war also accelerated social change. African Americans migrated north for factory jobs, and women entered the workforce, bolstering suffrage demands. However, the Treaty of Versailles' harsh terms humiliated Germany, planting seeds for World War II. The U.S. Senate rejected the treaty and the League of Nations, retreating into isolationism, a decision that haunted the interwar years. Number 2. World War II, 1941 to 1945. The roots of World War II lie in the unresolved tensions of WWI, the Great Depression, and the rise of fascism. Hitler's expansion into Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, 1939, triggered Allied declarations of war. The U.S. remained isolationist until Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, which aimed to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and secure Japanese dominance in Asia. Underlying causes included U.S.-Japan rivalry over resources like oil and rubber, Japan's invasion of China, 1937, and the U.S. oil embargo pushed Tokyo toward desperation. Meanwhile, Hitler's genocide against Jews and conquest of Europe horrified the world but failed to sway U.S. public opinion until Pearl Harbor. The U.S. industrialized rapidly, becoming the arsenal of democracy. But the war also interned 120,000 Japanese Americans and tested nuclear weapons on civilians. Victory established the U.S. as a superpower, but ignited the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Number 1. American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was the inevitable climax of decades of conflict over slavery. The North's industrial economy clashed with the South's agrarian, slave-dependent system. Tensions exploded after Abraham Lincoln's 1860 election, seen by Southern states as a threat to slavery's expansion. South Carolina seceded first, followed by 10 others, forming the Confederacy. The war's trigger was the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, April 12, 1861, but deeper causes included the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott decision, and violent clashes like Bleeding Kansas. Lincoln initially framed the war as preserving the Union, but the Emancipation Proclamation 1863 redefined it as a moral battle against slavery. The Confederacy's defeat abolished slavery, but failed to secure racial equality, leading to Reconstruction's collapse and a century of segregation. The war's legacy debates over federal power, race, and memory still divides America. These wars weren't just about winning battles. They were about survival, ideology, and the price of power. But history isn't done with us yet. Want to uncover more game-changing conflicts that shaped our world? Subscribe now and hit the bell because tomorrow's video reveals the 3 wars that almost wiped out humanity. Don't miss the next chapter in our journey through history's darkest hours. Stay curious, stay informed, and I'll see you in the comments.